At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a complicated struggle for power here in Westminster between the House of Lords and the House of Commons, as to which group had the right to pass laws on behalf of the British people. This struggle was to have a profound effect on Irish affairs. Then, as now, all bills had to pass through both houses before becoming law. A bill passed in the Commons could be rejected in the Lords, and indeed this did happen with the defeat of the second Home Rule Bill in 1893. The problem was that at the time there was always a majority of Conservative peers in the House of Lords, and this would often lead to conflict when the Liberal government was elected to power in the House of Commons. In 1910, the Liberal Prime Minister, Herbert Henry Asquith, put forward a Parliament bill which was designed to restrict the power of the House of Lords. Under the bill, the Lords had to accept any budget voted on and passed by the House of Commons. From this point on, no other bill could be rejected, but merely held up in the Lords for 3 sessions. That's about 2 years. The Lords rejected this Parliament bill, and the United Kingdom was soon facing the most severe constitutional crisis since the time of King William of Orange. The issue was about whether or not Ireland should have Home Rule. If the power of the Lords was restricted, then the last barrier to Home Rule would be removed. The Conservatives knew that if they resisted for much longer, they would face another humiliating defeat in a general election. So the Parliament bill was passed, and Asquith remained as Prime Minister with the support of Labour and Nationalist members of Parliament. In effect, John Redmond and his colleagues in the Irish Parliamentary Party held the balance of power. In the circumstances, it seemed inevitable that a bill granting limited home rule for Ireland would become law in a matter of a few short years. The Unionists in Ulster were only too aware that they could soon be ruled by a Dublin Parliament. They felt betrayed and unable to trust anyone but themselves. The Northern Loyalists were determined to resist Home Rule, and so were set firmly on a course that would lead them outside the laws of the land. In 1904, a body called the Ulster Unionist Council had been formed. It had representatives from all the 9 counties of the province of Ulster. Captain James Craig was the Ulster Unionist MP for East Down. Son of a rich whisky distiller, he was a very skilled organiser and soon became the driving force behind Ulster Unionist resistance to Home Rule. In 1910, the Ulster Unionist Council formed a secret committee to buy weapons and equip an army of civilian volunteers who would be prepared to fight to resist Home Rule. Major Frederick Crawford was the most prominent figure of this committee. He had been an engineer on ships of the White Star Line and was a veteran of the war against the Boers in South Africa. Crawford was a born conspirator. He adopted assumed names or aliases such as Hugh Matthews and John Ferguson, and proceeded to write to 5 European arms manufacturers, 2 of them the largest in Germany and Austria. He asked for a quotation for 20,000 rifles and 1 million rounds of ammunition, and he said they didn't have to be the latest model. In fact, he actually preferred second-hand ones in good order. After a long period of absence, the gun had returned to Irish politics. The Ulster Unionists were arming themselves to resist Home Rule, and they now had a very capable leader in Edward Carson. Carson was a Dublin Protestant who had become one of the most successful lawyers of his day. He had been a member of previous Conservative governments, and he agreed to lead the Ulster Loyalists in the belief that if he could prevent Home Rule being applied in Ulster, then it could not be applied to the rest of Ireland. Carson made it clear that he would support the use of arms in order to stop Home Rule. I know the responsibility you are putting on me today, and in your presence I cheerfully accept it, grave as it is. And I now enter into a compact with you and with every one of you, and with the help of God, you and I together will yet defeat the most nefarious conspiracy ever hatched upon a free people. We must be prepared, the morning Home Rule passes, ourselves to become responsible for the government of the Protestant province of Ulster. Unionist leaders formed a provisional government ready to rule Ulster. Some thought that this was treason. Winston Churchill, the British Home Secretary, was the politician with the responsibility of putting forward the 3rd Home Rule Bill in 1912 for the Liberal government. In Belfast, Churchill was given a hostile reception outside the Grand Central Hotel, which used to stand here on the site now occupied by Castle Court Shopping Centre. Menacing crowds of demonstrators gathered in Royal Avenue outside the hotel and threatened to overturn his car, only to stop with cries of "Mind the woman" as they spotted Churchill's wife beside him. It was a bad beginning. things got no better. Belfast Corporation refused Churchill the use of the Ulster Hall, and so the Home Secretary had no choice but to speak to the supporters of Home Rule in a rain-sodden marquee tent in Celtic Park, in the Nationalist Falls Road area. Then, when the meeting was over, Churchill had to be escorted out of the city by a devious route, through nationalist areas where the inhabitants were sympathetic to the whole idea of Home Rule. People remembered the words of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, a quarter of a century earlier in 1886, and said that he left Belfast like a thief in the night. Bonner Law was leader of the Conservative Party. His father had been a Presbyterian minister in Coleraine, and he identified completely with Ulster Protestants. He ensured that the Conservatives gave their full support to the anti-Home Rule cause. On Easter Tuesday 1912, 70 special trains brought 100,000 loyalists to Belfast. After marching past the platforms, they listened to prayers and watched the largest Union flag ever woven unfurled from a 90-foot flagstaff. Edward Carson then introduced Bonner Law, who was the chief speaker of the day. He compared the position of the Northern Protestants to their ancestors, who just over 2 centuries before had defended the city of Londonderry during the famous siege of 1689.
Once again you hold the pass for the Empire. You are a besieged city. The timid have left you. Your Lundies have betrayed you, but you have shut your gates. The government have erected by their Parliament Act a boom against you to shut you off from the help of the British people. You will burst that boom. That help will come. And when the crisis is over, men will say, you saved yourselves by your exertions, and you will save the Empire by your example.
On Saturday the 29th of June, Protestant children on a Sunday school outing paraded through Castle Dawson, County Londonderry. They carried flags and banners with biblical texts and were accompanied by a band. There was no special political significance to the outing, but the children were attacked by members of the nationalist Ancient Order of Hibernians, who were also having a procession in the town. Several children were badly hurt, and some were found much later hiding in terror a mile away. By Monday, the story was in the Belfast newspapers, and Remember Castle Dawson soon became a loyalist watchword. On Tuesday, trouble broke out at the shipyards when Catholic workmen were surrounded by angry loyalists and ordered to leave the yards. Sectarian violence simmered throughout the summer, only to erupt in a serious incident on Saturday the 14th of September. The occasion was a football match at Celtic Park between the home team Belfast Celtic, supported mainly by Catholics, and Linfield with its fiercely loyalist following. Furious fighting broke out between the spectators, who used knives and even revolvers. 60 of the injured were treated at the nearby Royal Victoria Hospital. The danger of outright sectarian warfare loomed large, a prospect that alarmed the Unionist leaders, who knew that their cause would be damaged by violence and bloodshed. On the morning of Saturday the 28th of September 1912, Belfast city centre was packed with dense crowds of people. Like many thousand others in towns and villages throughout Ulster, they had come together in a common cause. The crowds of people had come to sign a solemn league and covenant in the newly built Belfast City Hall. The Ulster Covenant was a pledge to resist any moves towards granting home rule to Ireland. Men signed a covenant and women signed a declaration. In all, nearly 1 million people signed in towns and villages throughout Ulster. The Ulster Unionists were by now prepared to use the force of arms to prevent the rule of a Dublin Parliament being imposed on them. The events of Ulster Day began here in the Ulster Hall, when James Craig took his place beside Sir Edward Carson. The hall was full, and those present were reminded that there should be no applause, as this was a religious service. The packed congregation sang, "O God, our help in ages past," and after prayers and lessons had been read, the Reverend Dr. William McKean, the former Presbyterian moderator, rose to deliver his sermon. It mixed politics with religion, and quite clearly set out the viewpoint of the majority of Ulster Protestants. We are plain, blunt men who love peace and industry. The Irish question is at bottom a war against Protestantism. It is an attempt to establish a Roman Catholic ascendancy in Ireland, to begin the disintegration of the Empire by securing a second Parliament in Dublin. When the religious service ended, the Unionist leaders walked the short distance to the City Hall. They were accompanied by an honour guard carrying a faded yellow silk banner, which it was claimed had been carried before King William of Orange at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. Belfast City Hall was one of the most sumptuous public buildings in the United Kingdom and had only been opened 6 years earlier. When Sir Edward Carson arrived at the City Hall, he advanced to here, where there was a circular table placed directly beneath the dome. The table was draped with the Union flag, and on it was placed a copy of the Covenant. Carson signed the Covenant with a silver pen. Then other leading Unionists, such as the Duke of Abercorn, Lord Londonderry, and Sir William Ewart, also signed. Outside the City Hall, bowler-hatted stewards struggled to keep order as eager crowds of people came to sign the Covenant. It had been arranged that 550 men could sign at any one time. With the signing of the Covenant, the great mass of the Ulster Protestant population demonstrated that if need be, they were willing to fight to defend the interests of their community. In January 1913, the Ulster Unionist Council decided that up to 100,000 men should be recruited into a volunteer army to be called the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF. At first, dummy rifles made of pine were used to train the men who flocked to join the UVF, but soon many had real rifles in what had become a well-organised and disciplined force. The UVF contained a whole series of specialist units, which included cavalry, signallers, dispatch riders, doctors and nurses. The UVF saw great potential in motor transport and organised a motor car corps. In the event of an emergency, the corps was to be used to carry volunteers to the scene of the fighting and refugees away from it. By drawing up these plans, the UVF was well ahead of its time, because the regular army had yet to use motor transport in this way. The third Home Rule Bill was passed in the House of Commons, then rejected in the House of Lords. Even so, it now seemed only a matter of time before it became law. And with loyalists organising resistance, it appeared that some form of armed conflict was now inevitable. At first, the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, could see no way out of the crisis. In 1913, the government started to seriously consider the division or partition of Ireland into two parts. Under this plan, the areas in northeast Ulster that had a Protestant majority would be split off from the rest of Ireland. John Redmond knew that his nationalist supporters would not let him accept anything but an undivided Ireland ruled from Dublin. He said that Irish nationalists can never be assenting parties to the mutilation of the Irish nation. The two-nation theory is to us an abomination and a blasphemy. However, while the Ulster Unionists appeared united and strong, the Irish nationalists were weak and divided. In August 1913, a great strike began here at the showgrounds of the Royal Dublin Society in Ballsbridge. The tram drivers stopped their vehicles and simply walked away. Soon the entire Dublin working class had stopped work, locked out by their own employers. The strikers were led by Jim Larkin, the leader of the 1907 dockers' strike in Belfast. Martin Murphy, owner of the Irish Independent newspaper, led the employers who had decided to destroy the power of the union workers. There were violent confrontations between the strikers and police on the streets of Dublin. Many were injured, and Jim Larkin was arrested in one such incident. The strikers had to face real hardship as the dispute dragged on for months. Food ships from Liverpool arrived here at Dublin's North Wall Quay every week, and soup kitchens were set up to feed the starving strikers and their families. Eventually, however, the strikers drifted back to work, driven by poverty and hunger. The Great Lockout was over, but both employers and workers were supporters of the Home Rule cause. The whole affair had created a disastrous split in the ranks of Irish nationalists. On November 25th, 1913, 3,000 men enlisted in a new body called the Irish Volunteers. The Irish Volunteers were Irish nationalists who were pledged to support the authority of a Home Rule Parliament in Dublin. Professor Owen MacNeill from the Glens of Antrim was the president of the Irish Volunteers. Within 6 months, the Irish Volunteers had grown into a force of at least 100,000 men who had started to march and drill throughout Ireland. James Connolly was born in Scotland of Irish parents and was determined to fight for an Irish Socialist Republic. Connolly formed another group called the Irish Citizen Army. By the beginning of 1914, it appeared that events in Ulster were moving out of the control of the government. Herbert Asquith decided that decisive action had to be taken to prevent the Ulster Unionist Council from forming their own provisional government with the support of the UVF. A naval squadron including 7 battleships was sent to patrol the waters around Ulster, and preparations were made to send in troops to guard arms dumps and keep the peace. But all these plans came to a halt with an incident that came to be known as the Curragh Mutiny. At the Curragh military camp in County Kildare, 80 cavalry officers announced that they would prefer to be dismissed rather than lead their men against the Ulster loyalists. Their refusal did much to undermine the authority of the government in the eyes of the people of Ireland. At the time, the UVF was armed, but with a mixed collection of rifles that used different sorts of ammunition. In 1913, plans were made to smuggle a huge consignment of modern arms into Ulster from Germany by ship. Larne was chosen as the port where the main consignment was to be landed.
Only 12 men knew the exact details of the secret plan. But on Saturday, the 25th of April 1914, they mobilized the entire UVF in a highly effective military operation. A decoy ship, the SS Balmerino, was sent into Belfast Harbour to divert the authorities, while the SS Clyde Valley steamed into Larne Harbour under cover of darkness. In all, 25,000 German and Italian rifles and 5 million rounds of ammunition were landed here at Larne and at Bangor and Donaghadee. The guns were then distributed throughout the province by convoys of motor cars, then placed in hiding. It had been the first time that the motor car had been used in a large-scale military-type operation anywhere in the world. The UVF was now fully armed and ready to fight for God and Ulster.
As the danger of civil war in Ireland loomed ever larger, people wondered how the Irish nationalists would respond to the arming of the UVF. On the 26th of July, a yacht called the Asgard sailed into Howth Harbour near Dublin. It was owned by Erskine Childers, an Englishman who supported the Home Rule cause. The Asgard was carrying a consignment of rifles that had been bought in Germany. They were unloaded by units of the Irish Volunteers. Many were taken into Dublin city centre.
Troops were called out, but as they tried to confiscate the rifles, they were met by jeering, stone-throwing crowds. Some soldiers opened fire along the Liffey Quays, killing 3 people and wounding 38 others. Nationalists were incensed, knowing that the UVF had been allowed to bring in their guns without interference. Ireland was on the brink of a civil war.